Hey everyone, welcome to another car review. Today we're taking a look at the Jaguar XKR-S GT. Now that name is a bit of a handful, and that's because the base model of this car is just the Jaguar XK. Then they have an R model, an S model, and finally the GT, which we have here. Now the GT is an extremely rare car. There are only about 45 of these in the entire world. So since this car is essentially the best of the best of the best of the Jaguar XKs, this should be a hopefully phenomenal car to drive. I do not have a lot of experience driving Jaguars in Forza, and I don't have experience with them much in real life either. Back a few years ago when I was a parts delivery guy for an auto parts shop, we delivered to a Jaguar dealership all the time, and I always loved going there, and I dreamed about driving a lot of the cars that I would see there. I do know that Jaguars are some of my favorite stock sounding cars in the world, especially the newer ones. So let's go ahead and take this car out on the road for a test drive and see if the performance and the sound are up to my admittedly high expectations for this car. So we'll start as always by listening to the car. Okay, no, this is all wrong. I'm sorry. This is admittedly one of my least favorite car sounds in the game, at least in comparison to how good I know this car sounds in real life. I'm actually going to just splice in a clip here of what the car actually sounds like for you guys. So you are, of course, welcome to form your own opinion, but to me, that just sounds terrible compared to the real car. But let's move away from sound and talk about performance, which, to be honest, is what matters a little bit more here. So as far as performance goes, I'm actually really liking how the car is handling. As you can see, I'm on snow. This is a rear-wheel drive car, and it's admittedly pretty manageable. Obviously, I'm getting a little bit of slipping and some oversteer, but that's perfectly fine in these types of conditions. The Jaguar starts at almost the top of A-Class, but I definitely see this pushing at least into S1. So let's go ahead and hop over to the mods window and see what we can do to it. So starting with tire compounds, it looks like we can just upgrade into race, and then we also have the off-road and drag tires as well. Now for wheel spacing, there's sadly no option here, but to be honest, the fitment looks pretty good as is, so not too upset about that. Now we're going to have the standard front arrow, however, you'll notice it's a black tow hook instead of a red one, which, I'm going to be honest, makes a pretty noticeable difference to me. For the rear wing, we have the standard Forza rear wing, which I don't actually hate on this car. I'm actually not a big fan of the stock wing. I think it's got kind of a weird curve to it. As far as engine swaps goes, we have one option. It's the 5.2 liter V10, which probably sounds better, but we also have an all-wheel drive drivetrain swap, as is standard with rear-wheel drive cars. So I'm going to go ahead and make a tune here. I'll be back in a second for you. And we're back with a rear-wheel drive S1 class road tune for the Jaguar XKR-S GT. Now this car is pushing over 660 horsepower and weighs just a hair over 3,000 pounds. You'll notice I put on the Forza front lip, which I think for one of the first times ever actually looks like it came on the car stock, which again, really big deal. I love that black tow hook and the fact that it kind of matches with the existing aero and color scheme of the rest of the car. I also threw on the Forza rear wing because, to be honest, I didn't think it looked any worse than the stock rear wing. If anything, in my own opinion, looks a little bit better. And it unlocks rear downforce tuning, which is nice to keep the rear end in check on the rear wheel drive car. So as far as driving, this car drives phenomenal. More oversteer, more controlled oversteer rather, and turn-in ability than many other rear-wheel drive S1 cars that I've driven. You're really able to be on the throttle a lot more in high-speed cornering than you normally would be, which means you can, of course, carry more speed through the corners. So let me take a second to just talk about the car's looks, because we haven't really had a chance to talk about that as a whole yet. And I've got to say, this car is gorgeous. I mean, just looking at the side profile here, the length of the car, the smooth body lines with the existing aero, that rear diffuser, it's all just this really, really nice complete package. And in the middle of this review, I probably took a dozen photos of this car just because of how good it looks, especially in Horizon 4's environment. So now back to performance here. In the S1 tune, we have quite a bit of power, 663 horsepower. In a rear-wheel drive build. So obviously our main concern is going to be excessive oversteer and drifting, but as long as you're good with managing throttle control, that's not an issue. It does like to kind of sneak away from you. You can kind of feel the weight of the car here, but as soon as you kind of wrangle that in and get it under control, it is very consistent. And it drives quick. It can handle a lot of lateral Gs, again, as long as you're good with your throttle control. This is a car that definitely rewards careful driving. So with the way I test these cars, it's 4 laps around my test track, and in most cases, the second, third, and fourth laps are usually within a second or two of each other, but that was not the case here. My times just kept improving lap after lap, so that just goes to show that there is a learning curve to this car, but that of course increases how rewarding it feels to drive. I always like a bit of a challenge, and this car definitely gave me that. So let's go ahead and pull up the leaderboard and see how it stacks up against other S1 cars. The Jaguar XKR-S GT did the lap in 2:18.283, handily beating the Camaro, which was our reigning champ for I think almost the entire review series so far. But let's hop over to the Hokie score and see how it does there. Starting with looks, I'm giving the Jaguar a clean 9. There's just one small issue that I have, and that's that the rear end, especially with the stock rear spoiler, just has a bit too much of a curve to it, and especially with the Forza camera, just doesn't quite look right when you're driving it. Now for sound, I think I'm giving it a 1, especially compared to just how good this car sounds in real life. There's just no justice being done there. It's a 1. Now for customization, it's not getting a high score for pretty obvious reasons, but I'm still giving it a 3, partially because of that black front tow hook, which really does make a difference, and because the Forza rear wing actually doesn't look that bad on the car. For the fun factor, I'm giving the Jaguar a 7. It might have been higher when I was first learning to drive the car, and it felt really rewarding to get much faster times over and over again, but now that I do know more or less how to drive and control the car, I'm bumping it down a notch because at its core, it's not quite as fun as some of the other cars I've driven. Now moving into competitive, I'm giving it a 4 for drag. You can put some good power in it, but it's just pretty heavy even with weight reduction. Now rally is a pretty similar story, but I'm giving it a 5 here just because it's actually pretty fun to drive in an off-road setting. For race, I'm giving it an 8. You saw how well it did on the lap time leaderboard, but I know there's a lot more possibility out of S1 class cars, and admittedly, this car is a bit tough to wrangle, especially at first, and you have to be really aware of your oversteer. For drift, I'm giving it a 7.5. The wheelbase and the engine are set up pretty well for controlled drifting, but again, it's heavy, which just hurts the peak performance, and there aren't too many options as far as customization goes, so you're limited to a pretty tight window of grip and horsepower for your drifting style. Finally, for online, I'm giving it a 4. There's just not too much place for this car outside of racing, but it would be too easy in an online live scenario to make a mistake, so there's not too much value here in online for the Jaguar XKR. Now moving on to the right side for flexibility, we're looking at a score of 5.5, mostly propped up by those race and drift scores. Now for style points, it gets a pretty easy 4. I mean, come on, it's a Jag, and it's a really rare Jag at that, so if you pull up in this, I'll be pretty happy. So with that said, this brings us to a final score for the Jaguar XKR-S GT of 54. ending up just about in the middle of our Hokie score leaderboard, and if you ask me, that's a pretty fair score. Obviously it looks good and it races pretty quick, but at least to me personally, unless I was really in a Jaguar driving mood, there's not too much standout reason for me to take this car over some of the other more personal favorite S1 cars. So if you want a good S1 offline racing car, and if you like Jaguars, or maybe even just want a really good photo shoot candidate, this is definitely the car for you. I still recommend giving it a look, even if it didn't make its way into my personal favorites list. So guys, that just about wraps things up for our review on the Jaguar XKR-S GT. I hope you enjoyed the review, and I'll be seeing you for the next video. Thanks for watching.